Well, hello. My name is Vasilios Kosmakos. I'm the lead coordinator on the History of Florida Water Management Project. It's a pleasure to meet you. Today's date is Wednesday, October 13th. It is 11:01 a.m. and I'm here with my coworker Ronan Hart, and who I have the pleasure of speaking with today.
Yeah, speaking to Pat Frost.
Hello, Mr. Frost.
Oh, don't say Mister.
Uh,
Okay.
Just call me Pat.
hello, Pat. That sounds better. To start off with, just a little easy question. If I can just ask you where you were born, and if you can discuss your family for me.
Where I was born?
Yes, sir.
Oh, I was born in Iowa to a kind of generally a farming family. 1953 is when I was born. So, and you want, I don't know what else you want to, kind of, my family moved to California in 1968. And I ended up in Florida in 1982, originally to work for the Florida Department of Transportation as an environmental specialist, working on Florida Keys Bridges replacement project. So the bridges that are there now aren't the bridges that were there originally, and they were demolishing the old bridges and saving some of them for their historical value. And I worked on that, and I went to work for the St. John's River Water Management District in December of 1983.
Okay, but before we get there, do you want to say anything else about your family or about your education, where you went to college, how you got?
Yeah, I guess not too much. I mean, family wise, again, kind of just my dad was a kind of farmer laborer kind of person. My mom was a nurse. I have one sister. She's in theater. And education, once I got out here to California, I was still in high school. I went to the University of San Francisco and got my bachelor's degree. After I got that, I went in the Peace Corps in El Salvador for a couple of years as a biology teacher, science teacher. Went back to San Francisco, went to graduate school, went to work for, hard is kind of weird to talk about, but I went to work for the U.S. Defense Department as a contractor on the MX missile as an environmental specialist. So somebody trying to protect endangered species on a project that could, blow the world up several times over. But it was a pretty cool place. It was Vandenberg Air Force Base. It was like our own private national park, with all kinds of wildlife and stuff like that. After that, I actually, we kind of lost our jobs. At some point they realized we didn't have the right security clearances to, as biologist types on this missile project. So we got laid off, and I actually went to Ireland, which is where I met Ronan's mom, actually in Westport. She was a Boy Scout troop leader with her older sister, Emer, I think it was, and I met him on a hike to Kilpatrick. And then I came back to the States. I still didn't have a job, so I went to Florida to visit a friend or friends, and scored a job, with the Florida Department of Transportation.
So, would you mind kind of discussing how your kind of, role or kind of interest as a biologist kind of helped lead to your kind of, your work in the Florida water management kind of field?
So you guys are a little hard to hear, your volume. Let me see if I can turn up my speaker.
Maybe I need to speak more into it.
Can you repeat that again?
Yeah, so would you mind kind of discussing how your role and kind of career as a biologist kind of helped inform your kind of career in the Florida water management kind of field?
Oh, wow. When it really began, when I was at Vandenberg, I became, I kind of took a special interest in ornithology and birds. We were doing a lot of work related to a couple of species that were threatened, snowy plover, which is a little shorebird, and the least tern, which was a beach nesting bird. And in doing that, kind of began to develop my skills also in botany, because part of the job was to revegetate areas that were damaged, due to the construction of the MX missile kind of things. So when I got to Florida, the focus there, everything was about wetlands. So when I went to work for the Department of Transportation, the focus was on near shore kind of stuff, which is what I was doing, in California. But, as a DOT employee, environmental, we also had to kind of work on getting permits from the Department of Environmental Regulation, the Florida Department of Environmental Regulation, Miami-Dade County Environmental Department, and the South Florida Water Management District. And that involved having to delineate wetlands, figure out where the edges of wetlands were, try to guide the engineers away from wanting to damage those wetlands, and in places where they couldn't, you got to cross, if you got to build a bridge, you got to kind of cross the river kind of thing. Then how to mitigate those. And that kind of is what got me kind of going in kind of wetland science, which is what led to going to work for the Water Management District, doing exactly that same kind of thing, but on the other side of the table, of issuing permits or denying permits to try to reduce the damage to wetland ecosystems. And I guess that's kind of how it kind of evolved.
And what year did you begin working for the district?
Well, I'm sorry?
What year did you begin working for the water management?
1983, December 3rd, to be exact.
In that time, we're curious what the kind of culture of the district was, what kinds of people were attracted to that work.
And also specifically what district you were working in.
Yeah.
St. John's River Water Management District. So the culture, I don't know. Well, it was kind of different because I was hired as the first kind of environmental specialist doing wetland regulatory work who wasn't located at the headquarters in Palatka. I was stationed in Melbourne, Florida, and I was the only, kind of college educated professional in what was called the Melbourne Field Station. So the culture there was very different from the culture in Palatka, which was, cubicle after cubicle of scientists. I was in an environment where they were, backhoe and bulldozer operators, and you guys that drove around in the swamps in their, boats and that sort of thing. They were more blue collar kind of people, and they kind of helped manage the upper basin of the St. Johns River, which at that time was, lots of levees and canals and, water management, in the very physical sense of the word, kind of structures. But, certainly the kind of people that were being attracted, this is 1983, so, it's only a few years after the first Earth Day. So, the people who were coming to work, first, the biologist types were all, desperate for work because it's hard to get work as a biologist. So they were taking whatever jobs they could kind of get, probably in a lot of cases. But just, I guess the culture was really dedicated to the environment, I guess would be, that's the kind of people, that were, and the engineering people too. It's a special brand of, civil engineer that doesn't just want to try to, build something long and straight that can, convey water, but wanted to, people that had a vision for, natural systems, kind of managing floods and managing water quality in the same at the same time then enhancing it, environmental conditions for wildlife and fish and that sort of thing.
Mm-hmm. So even among the more like blue collar, like you said, backhoe operators, there's still a sense that this was important work. It was more than like just a job, like at that environmental.
I think they saw that as important work, but I think probably much more so, organized around it's the job. I mean, they were, all of them were big hunters and fishermen, so they had an environmental conservation ethic that, was probably pretty deep. Understanding that you gotta do the right thing out there, or there won't be anything to hunt or fish in the future.
Mm-hmm. So we understand there's sort of a pivot in the goals of the district from flood control, more in the 70s, towards water conservation. Were you there when that change in directive happened, or was that before your time?
I think it really wasn't a pivot in changing from flood protection to water conservation or water quality protection. It was a pivot in how you do it, because it was still, the upper part of, the headwaters of the St. Johns River, there was this huge project that had already started before I got there, the Upper Basin project. But it was all about just changing the way things were managed to protect against flooding. And you think about probably the bigger pivot that was happening was really related to regulation, which is the part that I was kind of getting in on the kind of early stages. The management and storage of surface waters permitting program, MSSW, which evolved over time. That was becoming, there was greater and greater, kind of public demand for, more regulation on how land development happened, how, flood protection happened, how roads got built and that sort of thing. And that was becoming a bigger and bigger force within the organization. When I first got there, I was the first environmental specialist, in the Melbourne office. Now there's a huge, Melbourne field station, full of regulatory folks as well as other staff, that are dedicated to, both regulatory work and then the sciencey kind of management work.
So would you kind of mind discussing, kind of exactly what the biological implications were for the way they kind of, for the way they did make that transition, and kind of the flood practices, right? So, for example, can you hear me? Sorry.
No, I'm still having a little trouble.
So would you mind kind of discussing the biological implications for the way they kind of, transitioned from that kind of way of managing, from the way they kind of manage these floodwaters, right, to kind of the more holistic approach that they kind of took, right? So, from my understanding, right, they kind of, stopped, there's been at least a process recently, right, where, back in the day, they kind of made the rivers straight, right, so they can manage these floodwaters more. But now they're kind of trying to, make them more kind of, curvy like they are naturally. Can you kind of discuss kind of?
Well, I think, yeah, and I wasn't really, I wasn't really deeply involved in that. So, probably when you talk to Carol Fall at 1:30 this afternoon, you'll get a better feel for that, because she was more involved in that and involved in it earlier. I was kind of looking on the outside, kind of looking in on that. But the bot, I think probably fundamentally it was, instead of just trying to build levees and dams and water control structures, it was trying to restore former floodplain to the wetland floodplains that they used to be, to manage floodwaters more naturally.
And why is that important? Why did that need to be done? as opposed to what they were kind of doing before?
I don't feel comfortable. I really wasn't involved in that.
Fair enough. So looking through history, it seemed like you worked under Sonny Vergara and Henry Dean as two different executive directors.
Only Henry Dean. Sonny was not the executive director when I got there.
I see. So did
Henry was fairly new at it. I don't really remember when he started as executive director. So yeah, I didn't work for Sonny.
Who was ED when you came in then?
Henry Dean.
Okay. Did you see was there a change at some point when you were working there? Did another one come in?
Henry Dean was the executive director the whole time I was there. I was there until January 4th, I think it was, 1999.
And would you mind discussing kind of his personality, his philosophy, and his managerial style?
I don't know. Thoughtful, but politically astute.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, he worked for I think ultimately, it's an issue of we all worked for a board of directors that were appointed by the governor of the state. So, as governors changed and boards changed, the emphasis of the agency changed a little bit too.
Could you talk more about that? How the change in the governor's administration impacted the work y'all were doing?
Yeah, I mean, so when I started, who was Bob Graham, I guess, was governor at the time, and I think Henry had a strong personal relationship with him from previous work he had done before he came to the Water Management District. I can't remember. He worked for Department of Natural Resources or something like that. I can't remember with the state, but and the board, was it was a mix of kind of good old boy kind of folk, representing, different timber and ag interests, but also there were, appointees who were more urban and had already been affected by kind of early environmental movement kind of things, and had an eye towards that. I think, and then we had a switching governors, and we had a Martinez.
Yeah.
Made Bob Martinez a Republican, and all of a sudden, as somebody working in the regulatory world environment, it became a lot harder to be tough on a permit applicant that you thought that was doing too much destruction. It got a lot harder to kind of get them to change their plans, and it became much more facilitating getting those permits issued as quick as you possibly could, as a kind of thing. And then Lawton Childs was, I think, the next governor, and things kind of shifted back, and we had certainly a much more. That's when I kind of got into management positions and much more environmentally focused board members, people like Reed Hughes, Pat Harden. Pat Harden was one of the founding members of the Friends of the Wekiva River. Reed had an interesting background. He actually had been somehow involved in the petroleum industry in Florida. I think owned a whole lot of independent gas stations, sold all that, became just hardcore environmentalist.
Sorry, who's this person? What's their full name?
Reed Hughes.
Are they still around?
I don't know. I mean, last year was the first winter I didn't get a Christmas card from him.
Oh,
So I'm not sure. He's from the Daytona Beach area,
mhm.
but somebody like, Catherine Manella would probably know if he's still.
Yeah.
I mean, he was not a young man when he was on the board.
Okay. Catherine put us in touch with Pat Harden, who we're going to talk
Yeah, Pat would know too.
Yeah. If Reed didn't come up, I fear the worst. Though it sounds like
Yeah, I mean, he was probably in his 70s when 20 years ago.
Oh, yeah.
But anyway, so the board certainly was, and that was an era of adopting a lot of more robust environmental regulations. Kind of, we were developing these what were called special basin rules. Well, that actually, the first one was before that, the Wekiva River Special Basin Rule, then the Econ-Lockhatchee, Special Basin Rule. We did one for the Geneva Bubble, which is an aquifer in the northeast of Orlando. That was this isolated kind of freshwater lens, kind of floating on salt water. And there was a fear that if there was too many wells, too many draws on that freshwater lens, it would be rapidly depleted. So there was that, and then the one that Reed Hughes pushed, which was the Tomoka River and Spruce Creek Special Basin rules. So it was an era of an kind of an expansion of environmental regulation, and then I left. I left before Jeb Bush became governor.
So what are special
on purpose?
What are special?
What are special?
Yeah, what are special?
Okay, so yeah, you're breaking up a little bit, but that's okay. I think you said what are special basin rules? Yeah. Okay, so there's this basic kind of foundational rule, for regulating land development, especially. So, that was the management storage of surface waters rule, which is a regulation adopted by the board of the Water Management District, and it regulated, how you could do alterations to the landscape, and you had to demonstrate that you weren't increasing flooding, that you were protecting water quality, and that you were protecting wetland resources. And that applied everywhere in the district, from Vero Beach, all the way to Amelia Beach, kind of thing. So, and from the middle of the state to the coast. So the idea of a special basin rule came up with the Wekiva River, which is, of course, was in rapidly urbanizing Orlando, a spring-fed river, that there was great concern, enough concern about the land development that was occurring in that area, kind of Altamont Springs north to Sanford kind of area. There was enough concern that in the community, this Friends of the Wekiva River were formed, and they advocated for having additional protections in the form of additional kind of criteria that would be applied within the boundaries of that watershed. So it was a watershed specific set of rules. So the kind of, in the case of the Wekiva River, it being a spring-fed river, one of the real concerns was recharging those springs, making sure that when it rained, enough of the water infiltrated back into the aquifer to keep those springs functioning at the way they had been functioning, forever. So there were rules adopted to encourage recharge. You had to make stormwater ponds bigger and have them store more water that couldn't be discharged into the surface waters, but had to be infiltrated into the ground. And then the other was kind of protecting kind of the edges of the river system by creating kind of a riparian habitat protection zone. So not only were you protecting the regulations already in the management and storage of surface water rule protected the wetlands, but this protected a zone adjacent to the wetlands to help protect the wetlands even better. And it was, we had the University of Florida, I can't remember which group, but Mark Brown was a professor at the time, and Joe, can't remember Joe's last name now, Schultz or Schmidt, something like that. And they did all this analysis of how much upland buffer did you need to protect the wetlands, to protect the river. And that's what was established. It was actually a minimum of 550 feet from the normal water line out, or all of the wetlands. If the floodplain was wider than 550 feet, it was all the wetland floodplain plus 50 feet. And essentially, it wasn't a prohibition from building within that zone, but it made it really hard to build within that zone. So that's what a special basin was. So then we did that with the Wekiva, and it seemed to be working. And then all of a sudden there was a Friends of the Econlockhatchee River, they emerged, and they, a couple of years later, said, we want the same kind of thing for the Econ, because land development, land development was moving to that east side of Orlando a lot more. So a similar rule, similar analyses were done, and there wasn't a spring issue there, so there wasn't that recharge requirement, but there was that riparian habitat protection zone kind of requirement. And then when Reed Hughes got on the board at the, a few years later, his special concern were the Tomoka River and Spruce Creek in Volusia County area. So we went through a similar kind of analysis. So,
and what year were these kind of events taking place? So what year was the Wekiva project taking place? What year was the other?
I'm thinking the Wekiva I think the rule was adopted in 1986 or so. Again, if you need to know for sure, Catherine was in the thick of it, so she could tell you probably the hour of the day that the board adopted the rule. So that was in 86, and the Tomoka Spruce Creek rule, which was the last one, was in the early 93, 94, something like that, I'm going to guess.
That really.
And I got to tell you, go ahead, Ronan.
Well, I was going to, if you were about to tell a story, add on to that, you can go ahead. I was going to change the direction.
Well, it kind of goes to, you asked about how was Henry as a executive director, and the Tomoka Spruce Creek rule was getting nowhere. We are getting the science guys. Mark and Joe were still doing their science to try to help us figure out the riparian habitat protection zone, and were there other things that we needed to be, interested in. But it just wasn't gaining traction. And I got called into Henry's office. At this point, I think I was working in Palatka. I'd moved from Melbourne to Orlando and Orlando to Palatka. And he said, I just think we need you. He said, Pat, you need to convince Reed Hughes that this rule isn't just, we don't have the oomph, we don't have the board support to get this thing approved and all that kind of thing. He says, but it's up to you, Pat, to kind of figure out how to do that with Reed, because Reed and I had become pretty close. And so I called Reed, and Reed, before I could say anything, he says, I was just going to call you. I said, okay. He says, yeah, I got a reporter from the whatever the newspaper was in Volusia County, the Daytona, whatever. And he says, she wants to go on a trip on the Tomoka River, a canoe trip on the Tomoka River. And I told him, you could arrange it, and we need to make sure Henry goes on the trip, because, this could be the make or break on this rule. We got to get some more public support, because there was no Friends of the Tomoka River. That was the difference between that and the earlier ones. There was Reed saying this is really important thing to do. And so we arranged for a couple of canoes, and this reporter met us on the banks of the river, and I can't remember what bridge, what highway. Henry came along, and Henry's not a little guy. He's a pretty good sized guy. And so I was I arranged for, a more expert canoeist to be in the canoe with Henry. And I was in the canoe with the reporter, and Reed didn't come along. And we get in the water, and Henry is really kind of telling his story to the reporter that, we are starting getting a lot of support for this, for this rule in from the public or the press or whatever. And the next thing you knew, just almost, it was like it was staged, but it clearly wasn't. But a manatee surfaced in the river, and then a manatee calf surfaced on the river, and they nosed right up to the canoe where Henry was, and he's like looking at him and saying things that I won't repeat, but he was just totally amazed. By the time we got done, we got to the takeout point on the river. He says, "We're going to make this thing happen." And it just totally, it really got, it allowed him to peel away kind of the being the executive director and the politics of it all and all that kind of thing. And he realized the Tomoka River really was an important and special place. And so we redoubled our efforts and got the thing passed. Anyway, that kind of encapsulates to me a lot of Henry.
Mm-hmm. That's a really fantastic story. It kind of gets to what I was about to ask. This sounds like a really landmark form of regulation that went very far in protecting these habitats. So I was wondering what kind of political battles like that would involve. I'm sure developers weren't a fan of that kind of rule. Is that something that's felt for you?
The Wekiva rule, and I was actually in Melbourne when the Wekiva rule was being adopted. So I was kind of, again, looking kind of from the outside in on the people who were involved in it. But, it certainly, and again, Catherine knows, she probably was the litigator for the water management district, defending the rule. But yeah, it certainly met with opposition. But I would have to say the Wekiva rule and the econ rule, my observation was that people with lots of land, big developers, they had the ability to adapt their land use plans to still make a profit and meet the rule. And in doing so, they also learned to market their properties to their advantage because of the rule. Because all of a sudden, they could say your house is backing up on the Wekiva River, special environmental place, and and you can be guaranteed there's nobody's going to build a house behind you tomorrow, that kind of thing. Where we really saw the battles after the rules were adopted, Wekiva and the econ, and I left too soon after the Tomoka Spruce Creek rule that I didn't really see how it played out. But the rules, those special basin rules for the Wekiva and econ, honed in to such a fine degree that a single family lot was regulated by those rules. And if all you have is a lot that you bought before the rule was in place, and now this rule is there, you don't have, as just a person with one housing lot, a lot of flexibility on what you can build and how you can build it and where you can build it. All of a sudden, it becomes a pretty significant constraint on what you can do. And it was some of those single family lot owners that actually were the hardest to work with, because they just didn't have, the ability to move their house around, or, and they wanted a dock out to the river through the riparian habitat protection zone. And they didn't have any extra land to say, well, I can mitigate that impact over here. There was no over here for them, because they just had that. So there were, in the Wekiva, I recall, there were two legal cases. One was called the Womack property, WOMACK, and the other was the Saboff property. And and smart lawyers find them, and all of a sudden, we're in court a bunch. But in the econ was even trickier, because that riparian habitat protection zone not only was adjacent to the natural river, but the upper parts of the Econ River had been channelized a lot. There were a lot of canals and things that were considered waters of the state of Florida. So that meant that riparian zone was on either sides of really what was an artificial construct. There was one case way in the upper reaches of the Econ, almost in the outskirts of downtown, eastern downtown Orlando, called the Koontz case, Koontz. And we worked and tried every which way to come up with a palatable design that would get them a permit. But this guy, he just wasn't buying into it at all. And so they sued the Water Management District, and it actually went to the U.S. Supreme Court. The Water Management District lost.
What were the implications of that?
I don't know. I was long gone. They would probably had to pay him. They probably had to pay him a pile of money, I would imagine. Or I think it went on so long that Mr. Koontz, Coy Koontz, was the guy's name. I think he'd probably died. It was probably his children that probably finally settled. I don't know, but so these things got. And I don't know, and I haven't really paid attention to the Water Management District regulations in the last 20 years. I've been out here almost 21 years, so I've been gone for a long time. Maybe they had to change the rules. They maybe had to adapt the rule to somehow accommodate those kind of conditions. I don't really know. Again, Catherine would be, she'd be in the know, or Jeff Elledge, I think. If you haven't talked to Jeff, you'll probably talk to Jeff.
Yeah, he's on the list.
Yeah.
So where did you go? Actually, before that, just out of curiosity, 92 Hurricane Andrew, was that, did that change anything for water management districts? Was the effect of that or any of the flooding important in the way y'all were doing work?
Well, what I mostly remember is that the St. John's River Water Management District sent a bunch of engineers to South Florida to help deal with it. That was probably the biggest impact, because it was all a very South Florida kind of hurricane. And I don't really remember. I don't remember after that hurricane a big move to change our regulations or anything like that in particular. I think the kind of things that got changed were more building codes, on keeping houses from falling apart in the big wind. But my recollection, it was more of a big wind kind of hurricane than a flooding hurricane. But again, it didn't really. I don't really remember it affecting us more than we'd just lost a lot of staff for a while. So all of our work slowed down.
So, will you mind discussing the SWIM Act, right? So the Surface Water Improvement and Management Act. Were we there when that was passed, and what implications did that act have on policy?
Drawing a blank.
SWIM? No. All
Fair
right.
enough.
So,
Was that the one that adopted what would be now called total maximum daily loads?
Good question. So I guess none of us know.
No, I'd say see if you can stump Carol at 1:30.
Okay, we'll ask her that.
She was into water quality stuff a lot more than I was.
Well, how about the Florida Water Quality Assurance Act? How did that change the district? Do you
It didn't really get involved. Yeah.
All right.
So where did you go after you left the district then?
I came here to Northern California, to Trinity County.
To do just to
Work to manage, become essentially the executive director of what you guys would call a soil and water conservation district in Florida. In California, they're called resource conservation districts. So our conservation district was just getting deeply involved in working with the federal government on the restoration of the Trinity River, the river that you don't remember kayaking on. And so I think the RCD board saw, my work in Florida on special basin rules and things like that as applicable, wetland kind of stuff. So I came to work and stayed until I retired in 2012. But the RCD, the river restoration really turned out, evolved to be a smaller piece of our total work than it was when I first got there. We actually have gotten a lot more involved in forestry kind of issues because, that's the big driver here, having forests that are more resilient against wildfire and that sort of thing.
Mm-hmm.
So now kind of taking a step back for a more big picture approach, right? Kind of given everything you kind of learned in your career, how do you think water should be managed in Florida? What general philosophy do you follow, or what set of principles do you think works best?
Can you say that again?
How do you think water should be managed in Florida?
In terms of general philosophy or best practices and principles.
For me personally, you mean? Or
yeah, what's your philosophy?
Probably more with regards to wetlands. I am more inflexible about allowing them to be damaged than I was when I was at the Water Management District, which was, the underlying theme of regulations is, what is the allowable, there's some level of damage that is acceptable. And I think, probably, especially living in California. So Florida, 50% of the state of Florida is wet, is either water or a wetland. California, we have, from our pre-European settlement period to now, we have 9% of the historical wetlands left. And so, I'm probably much more of an absolutist that you can't screw around with them now, because I live someplace where they're almost all gone. So anyway, so it kind of shaped it shaped my view, but I kind of feel glad that now I can be a little more ardent in my desire to protect them for the ecological benefits and the human benefits that they provide.
Mm-hmm. And then, can you discuss the pros and cons to the way the board of directors is appointed, in Florida, right? So they're obviously appointed by the governor. Why do you? What's good about that? Why? What's bad about that? What's your philosophy
about
about the board of directors and how they're appointed by the governor as opposed to officials?
Well, I think appointments by the governor, appointments versus election, if you kind of, in my view, so if you're elected, you're always running for office. And so, so being appointed, you're appointed for a term, a 4-year term or whatever, and you can get reappointed, but you're not overtly having to be looking over your shoulder, wondering if your decisions are going to help or hurt your ability to get reelected. So I think, on that level, certainly appointments are better. Appointments, when you're appointed, you got to be appointed by somebody, right? If you're not going to get elected. And, whether it's appointments by the governor or appointments by, the head of the Department of Environmental Protection, or if they were appointments, having to be, voted on by the Florida Assembly or Florida House and Senate, the Florida legislature. All of those carry with them some level of political philosophy. So, the upside and the downside. I mean, managing natural resources is a long haul thing. That's something I didn't really think about in Florida so much, but now that I'm engaged in forestry kind of things, you're managing natural landscapes for 50 or 100 or 150 years, and you're doing it, unfortunately, if you've got an appointed board or an elected board or however that's run, you're doing it based on very short-term goals, and as I kind of described, going from Bob Graham to Bob Martinez, to Lawton Childs, the emphasis changes, and if this is kind of like the level, this is kind of average and more environmental here and less environmental there, it's doing this all the time. And while we as people can adapt to that and we make it work, it's harder to manage sustainable natural resources when you have to do it in short-term increments. That when you can change 180 degrees, with one election in November every 4 years, and that's not good. That's not good resource management. But I don't know. I mean, a governing body has to get there somehow. It's not spontaneous generation. They have, so it's just an inherent issue that you have to deal with appointing or electing the people who are going to run things.
Mm-hmm. So do you have, opinions on what changes could be made to the way water management is done in Florida going into the future?
I guess I don't, because I'm kind of out of the loop on how it's being managed right now. But, on a, purely selfishly political level, I think it's probably, with the prevailing politics of Florida right now, it probably is not very pro-environmental.
No.
So, I think that the resources are going to take a hit, and ultimately then that means the people of Florida are going to take a hit, because that's what sustains them. And it's probably the more critical, and I wasn't directly involved in, was the consumptive use of water side of things. At some point, that's a extreme limiting factor, is fresh water.
Mm-hmm. So I think that kind of couples with the question of the way climate change might affect water management, something like, rising sea levels and saltwater.
Yeah. Rising sea levels was even before we were talking about climate change, because we weren't talking about climate change when I was there 20 years ago. But rising sea levels, saltwater intrusion, along the coastal areas was all becoming more and more of an issue. More pronounced, wet seasons probably, is gonna change things. I haven't really paid attention to what the predictions are for, a changing climate on Florida. Does it get wetter? Does it get hotter? Does it get drier? I really haven't kept up on that, but I would think that it's going to mean a lot of adaptation. I mean, I just read somewhere some article, down in the Miami area, the sea level rise, and the saltwater intrusion are going to be pretty significant. I mean, Florida doesn't have you don't have a lot of places to climb up to higher. No. When sea level rises, and water tables rise, and people's septic tanks begin to fail, and
So
I got friends in Palatka that every summer, their septic tanks fail because the groundwater table is coming up higher than it used to. It's just those very personal kind of ways that this is affecting them.
Mm-hmm. So as those problems like that become more pronounced, what will water management have to, change? How are they going to deal with that going forward? Do you have any view on that?
Standing from 3,000 miles away. They're going to have to deal with they're going to have to deal with more flooding, and they're going to have to deal with either just accepting it or or adapting regulations, adapting, upper, flood protection kind of, projects have to change. It's weird if things that are currently, say, coastal wetlands would actually become submerged lands. They wouldn't even be wetlands anymore.
Mm-hmm.
And you get they're either gonna, but frankly, I don't see. I think the people of Florida have got to wake up and deal with that on a political level. Mm-hmm. And they don't seem ready yet.
Yeah.
And then, so how do you think that water permitting and water consumption will play into the future of water management? Water permitting and water consumption.
Oh, so the consumptive use permitting kind of. Well, I have to say, in some respects, I always point to people here in California. I point to Florida as an example of doing something really well that California clearly hasn't gotten right, and that's maximizing the reuse of wastewater. California, even when I was still there, it had gotten to the point where if you were going to build a new subdivision, you had to be putting in reuse water lines in addition to water lines and sewer lines. And if you were building a golf course, you had to, you pretty much had to use, retreated wastewater for irrigation, that sort of thing. California still hasn't really gotten that figured out. Even though we're in the second or third year of a multi-year drought. The lake that I live near, which is Trinity Lake, which is a huge body of water, right now it's 28% full.
Jeez.
So, and that's the optimistic way to look at it. The other way is looking at how empty it is, which is over 70% empty. So, we definitely, we're not winning the war of against drought. But I think, at some point there's a carrying capacity issue, in Florida as to how many more people you can absorb and maintain viable water supplies, not only for people, but for environmental uses. So I don't know, but I'd be interested to know how spring flows are changing, in the Wekiva River Basin. I would guess maybe spring flows are declining, with more and more land development. So I think, and I think I've read a while ago that Florida had gone to issuing much longer consumptive use permits. The water management districts, it used to be, when I was there, the maximum length of a permit was 10 years, but I thought they changed that to like 20 years without having to have that be reviewed, and the damage may be irreversible by the time you get to review somebody's permit again. So I think, while I never was directly involved in surface water or in consumptive use permitting, I think that's where that's going to be an essential pivot point.
I would love to ask you about other parts of your life, but I want to before we leave behind the water management district,
Yeah.
I want to see, is there anything else? Is there anything about your time there that you want to put into the historical record? Any other? I mean, I loved the story about the manatee. If you have other anecdotes.
It was great work. I mean, it was when I got to the point where I was managing the Orlando office of the Water Management District, and then moving to Palatka as an assistant department head, it got pretty stressful, I'd have to say, too. Because those pressures are, where's my permit, or that kind of thing. We're there every single day. But it was a very supportive leadership. I mean, I always found, the executive office at the time was, Henry Dean is the executive director, and John Wheely was the assistant executive director, and Charlie Myers. I don't know if you've heard his name. He was the deputy executive director, but he was a retired colonel from the Army Corps of Engineers. And while, that carries with it a very stern personality, he was probably the most supportive of the decisions that people at my level were making. I mean, he protected his troops, so to speak. If you made that decision and you could explain it, he was there to back you the whole way. And that fed up to John and Henry too. I mean, they were, as long as you could explain the why, they were there to support you, all the way. And I'm really, I'd say I'm proud of the work that we did, and I'm proud of those special basin rules that we did. I think I still, hear from Pat Harden now and then. And like I said, Reed Hughes is somebody that until last year, I got a Christmas card every year from him, kind of lifelong friendships, people like Lance and Deirdre, and today, a guy that I hired as an environmental specialist in Melbourne, John Juliana, he'd be a guy to talk to, because he became the manager of the Melbourne office, or what's now I think called the Palm Bay office. So he's been the manager of that office since 1987. He's got John Juliana. I can send you I'll email you his name.
Sure, thank you.
But he retires this week.
Oh, wow.
So, but that's after 33 years of almost all of that being, high-level manager. So he's probably seen it all, and I'm really proud of all, of the people that, and happy that I worked with them all.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Do you have another question on water management? Because I want to ask about El Salvador.
No, I think that's it.
Okay. So the Peace Corps in El Salvador, wasn't there a civil war going on at the time? There's
been a civil war going on since the 1930s. So so when I got there in November of 1976, was our group got to El Salvador. There was a presidential election actually underway, with the election was in February of 1997, and and the end result was, there was an election. The opposition candidate clearly, won the popular vote, but the military candidate, of the party in power essentially took over and gave that guy, his name was Claremont, gave he and his family free passage to, Costa Rica. And there was martial law, and there were like big demonstrations. They told us on the weekend of the election to not be anywhere around the capital of San Salvador, any of the bigger cities. So a bunch of us actually went to a cloud forest. But when we came back and we tried to, get to our bus stations, to get out to our villages where we lived. The buses weren't running because there was this, the downtown, the Parque Libertad was overwhelmed with protesters. And I sat in a cafe behind locked doors with other Peace Corps volunteers for like 8 hours. And we watched protesters run into the town square, and then you would hear gunshots, and then they would run out, and then ambulances would come in, and then the ambulances would go out. And then as the ambulances went out, the people ran back in, and there'd be more gunshots. And, the official story is 8 people were killed. Amnesty International said 800 were killed that day. And finally, at around almost sunset, this pickup truck showed up at the little cafe that we were all sitting in. And it was some, protester types who had been told by the people in the cafe that we were there. And they put us all in the pickup truck and drove us out to the U.S. Embassy to kind of get us away from, the danger. So there was martial law pretty much from that day, the rest of the 2 years I was there. But I think the Civil War people are mostly think of it, El Salvador began a little later than that. It kind of began with the assassination of Archbishop Romero.
This story is fascinating because I'm actually in the process of applying to the Peace Corps this month.
Oh, really?
Yeah. So I want to do the I want to do the mammoth field. So pretty much exactly the same thing you just kind of did.
Yeah.
So I'm kind of listening to this story. I'm kind of like trying to figure out what I'm getting into here. But that's kind of why I want to do it. I want to see the good, the bad, and the ugly.
Yeah. Well, one thing I was going to tell you is, despite all of that and how weird, every place you went, there were, soldiers with guns and on buses, and, you'd be on a bus and soldiers in gray uniforms would get on, and they would grab some guy and take him off the bus, and off you'd go, and you didn't know what happened to him. But I'd have to say, and it's probably a function of youthful ignorance, but I never felt unsafe.
Okay.
Okay. We went any place we wanted to go. We did whatever we wanted to do. None of that ever seemed to affect, I probably shouldn't go to that neighborhood, or I shouldn't go to that village, or I shouldn't get on that bus, but I think when you're young, but I don't know. I think right now they're just starting to send volunteers out to countries because of COVID.
Yeah.
They removed everybody from every country, at the beginning of the pandemic. So there'll be a huge need.
Yeah. Technically I should have had probably my application in by now, but they just released the new assignments like 10 days ago. And
okay, cool.
Yeah, and what I'm trying to do is I'm trying to get the application done by at least the initial portion by the end of the month.
Yeah.
And kind of go from there. But obviously, right? It's like Peace Corps seems to be a very common motif among people like you and kind of everybody else to kind of talk to you.
So
sustainable development kind of aspirations. So it definitely seems like the right kind of career path.
So Jeff Elledge was also in the Peace Corps. He was in Thailand. And as an engineer. So one of the weird things, just thinking kind of when I was talking about changes of administrations in the governor's office and how that changed, the focus of the water management district, the same thing happened with the Peace Corps. So when I signed up, applied and accepted the position as a teacher in El Salvador, Gerald Ford, the Republican, was the president of the United States, and we were being sent to be teacher trainers. We were going to work in, the major regional kind of state capitals, doing teacher training, and there were science teachers and art teachers, and that was our group. And the day that we flew to Miami to kind of get inducted into the Peace Corps, to get shots and all that kind of stuff, was the presidential election between Gerald Ford and Jimmy Carter. So a week later, we're in El Salvador, where we actually arrive in El Salvador, and for our language training and cultural training, which went on for 2 months. And the executive, or I guess the country director of the Peace Corps, came to speak to us one day, a week or two after we got there. And he said, so some of your assignments are getting changed. He said that, people who are going to be teacher trainers, you're going to just be sent out to villages to be teachers. And he said there's a change in philosophy when the new administration comes in. The transition team has already said that kind of going from the Ford technical assistance kind of programs to what they call basic human needs. So, going from a Republican president to a Democratic president meant a shift from being technical people, to being, in the villages, in the schools, with the kids and with directly teaching, working side by side with Salvadorian teachers. I'm actually glad that's the way it went, because it was probably a much richer experience.
So, I guess if that's the case, I should definitely tell my family, who I probably would incline them to vote for. It's my experience, right? So, that's really good to know, and that's kind of good to know kind of going forward. And if I can just ask you a question, was the Peace Corps, did you ever experience, was there a colonial kind of mentality kind of going in with your projects, or was it very kind of holistic and kind of very pure, if that makes any sense? Was there
between whom? Between
so the mission of the Peace Corps, right? Is it kind of colonial, or imperialist? Does America kind of want to impose its thing, or do you kind of feel?
Oh, I see what you're saying. Yeah. No. So that and the original idea, from John Kennedy was it was supposed to be just about person to person interactions.
Okay.
Every country's got its embassy, U.S. embassy, and they've got the U.S. aid for, Agency for International Development, and they've got all these, top-down colonial, as you described it, kind of organizations say, if you want this money, you got to do it this way, But the Peace Corps was really more about developing personal relationships, and I have to say, I certainly got more out of it probably than I put into it. I probably learned more than, the teachers learned from me, but, and I suppose, in a big geopolitical perspective, it's trying to make America more personable, to people, who are only getting, their snippets of news. And I'm sure that it's got to be totally different because of social media and internet and things like Zoom, than it was, when I was there. I was in a village at the end of the road, bus came once a day, left once a day. There was the only telephone in the town was that the telephone company had a little building, and you had to go in and give them, who you wanted to talk to in what town, and they would call, Osicala, and they'd say, this is Osicala, and this is San Jose de la Fuente calling Osicala, we want, we have a call for Jose, Rodriguez. And then some little kid would run off and find Jose Rodriguez and bring him back to the phone, and you'd have your phone conversation. And telegrams. When the Peace Corps really wanted to get a hold of us, like when things were getting weird and violent in Nicaragua, they would send us a telegram to tell us what to do. And that was it. I never in 2 years, I never talked to anybody from my at home, from my family, and we sent things called aerograms. I don't think people even know what an aerogram is anymore. No. Yeah. So you used to be able to go to post offices anywhere in the world and buy this one piece of paper that you would
won't be a huge deal if we lose the detail about the aerogram. Though I do hope he comes back. I want to ask him about college.
Lost the connection.
Yeah.
Did he just, he blinked off?
He just froze, yeah.
Oh, he just froze. Okay, hang on. Can refresh.
No. Oh, you guys froze up for a little bit. I was going to say you were frozen.
Yeah. Did you want to finish? We lost you when you started talking about the aerograms.
Oh, well, they were just a way to send a letter. They're just one piece of paper. You fold them up, you write on the inside, you fold them all up and address them, and then they were already self-stamped for airmail. I mean, airmail was something special versus surface mail back then. Anyway, that's how we communicate. So, once every week or so, I would send a aerogram to my family or to a friend, and I would only get mail, because there was no post office in my little village. So mail would come to the Peace Corps office in the Capitol, and so I'd get a big stack of mail and magazines and stuff, about once every 2 months. But now I imagine, people have, you go off to the Peace Corps somewhere, let's say, Lesotho, South Africa or something like that, and you're probably going to be able to have cell phone conversations and FaceTime conversations with people anywhere,
Yeah.
Oh, how did your parents feel about you going off to El Salvador? War?
I think they were a little apprehensive. I'm sure they were apprehensive, but at the time I didn't know of the political instability in El Salvador because it didn't make the news in the United States. So I think they just saw it as, was like a next step after going to college. Mm-hmm. And one of the things, I don't know if it's still true, but if you went into Peace Corps and did 2 years as a teacher, most states, when you came home, that qualified you for a teaching credential. Mm-hmm. So that was part of my motivation. I wanted to become bilingual in Spanish and English, and I wanted to be a teacher. And that kind of all made it was kind of like going off to a training camp.
Mm-hmm. Well, even if your career, ended up not going so much teaching, but you in water management, it still sounds like, what you did and what you learned there is at least a little bit applicable, at least as you're explaining about the change in administration having an effect.
Yeah,
so.
And it actually led, while I was at the water management district, our water management district in South Florida Water Management District entered into a cooperative kind of training program with Nicaragua. And so they sent, this was after the first administration, a Sandinista administration, they lost the election, and a woman named Victoria Chamorro became president. And so there was, U.S. was more friendly than they were when the Sandinistas were in power. And so we actually took 2 trips down to Nicaragua to meet with their, natural resources people to talk about water management kind of things and try to help them with some ideas and designs for using wetlands to treat wastewater and stuff like that. So actually my Peace Corps time led to me being able to be a part of that group that went to Nicaragua a couple of times.
That's awesome. And it kind of really just shows that, the broader kind of career implications that this can have.
Yeah.
It's great.
I'm sure the political battle over the special basin rule didn't really look like much after all the mass demonstrations you saw.
Yeah.
It was intense.
No, it was pretty. But on the flip side, I would have to say that when I was working at the conservation district, you'd have some bad days, days that weren't going your way, and I'd always tell people, this isn't a great day, but the worst day at the conservation district is probably a lot easier than the easiest day at the water management district.
Yeah.
So I think we need to finish up in a few minutes.
Yeah.
I do want to, just quickly ask you, going to college in San Francisco that was the 60s or the 70s, right?
72 through 76.
Yeah, so kind of height of the counterculture era. What was that like being on the ground for that?
That was pretty cool. I mean,
Yeah.
I can, yeah, I mean, I don't know, just so many experiences. So one of the more enduring kind of sets of experiences was that, have you been to San Francisco? You remember being in San Francisco? No.
Roughly.
So there's a Golden Gate Park, huge big park, and there's a long narrow strip of it called the Panhandle. And on the south side of the Panhandle is the Haight-Ashbury. On the north side is just regular neighborhood, which is near University of San Francisco, where I went to college. So I lived in an apartment above a grocery store on the university side of the Panhandle. But during that period on Sunday mornings, well, not early morning, but like 11 o'clock in the morning, bands would set up in the Panhandle and play free concerts. And I can remember just waking up to the sounds of sometimes the Grateful Dead, sometimes the Jefferson Airplane, sometimes Quicksilver Messenger Service, sometimes just bands of no particular noteworthiness but good music. You kind of wake up to the sounds of that music, which was always kind of pretty cool. I'd have to say that I know I missed some exams, exam days, because I was standing in line to get tickets to go to a concert, and I know that happened a couple of times. But the professors were pretty forgiving of that kind of thing too. Sometimes you would see some of the younger professors in the same line, kind of thing. So it was pretty interesting. It certainly wasn't the 1969, 67 to 69, Summer of Love kind of thing. It gotten a little grittier by then, drug abuse was probably a little more rampant, there were more street people, kind of thing, which was kind of weird. But yeah, it was pretty interesting. I mean, probably the best thing I think was going to a poetry reading that Allen Ginsberg had. I don't know if you know who Allen Ginsberg was, but yeah, so I mean, wow,
Yeah.
And that was just a free, go up to Lone Mountain College, which was the women's college next to the University of San Francisco, and in this big dining room, everybody sitting on the floor with him reciting poetry, so yeah, so that was the kind of stuff.
That's pretty amazing. I think we might be about to wrap up, but I mean,
yeah,
we'll give you a chance if you want to, put anything else into the historical record. Last word.
Probably not that, but I want to make sure that the next time you talk to Catherine Manella, you tell her that for this interview I had my lucky pocket knife.
Okay, I'll write that down.
Write that down, because that's important. She'll know what I meant. So what I did, what it was is that, when we had board meetings, those monthly board meetings, once I was in kind of the leadership group, we had to sit, at the table that faced the board members. And I have a pocket knife that I just always have with me, just all in my Swiss Army knife. But every once in a while, in the heat of getting ready for a board meeting and having to put the suit on for the first time in the month and all that kind of thing, I'd forget my pocket knife. And I'd always, when that happened, I knew something was going to go wrong with one of our project presentations to the board. So I would pass a little note down to Catherine, who was, the general counsel, and say, I forgot my pocket knife, so be ready, kind of thing. And so when Carol and I decided to move here, she bought me another little special knife that says good luck, which is my special good luck knife that I wear when I do important things. So
that's wonderful.
Yeah.
So where are you thinking of, where are you going to, what part of the world do you want to go in the Peace Corps?
Either South America or Africa. I have international studies and anthropology background. I speak spent 4 months in Ecuador, so South America just makes the most sense. But I want to do kind of sustainable development, so South America, Africa, kind of just makes the most sense for me.
Yeah. Okay. Cool.
Yeah.
Great. Well, good luck at that.
Appreciate it. Thank you.
I'm jealous. I should do something like that. It sounds
Well,
fun.
do what motivates you. You know.
True.
Yeah, I've wanted to do it since high school, so it's been on my mind for
Yeah.
you know.
Yeah. I knew it had been a long time goal of mine also, and it kind of fit the times. I mean, a lot of the people that I graduated from college with, went in either into the Peace Corps or what was the domestic program at the time called Vista, which now is AmeriCorps.
Yeah.
A lot of people did that, for a year or 2 years.
Well, I think we would all benefit from keeping in touch then, because I think we could keep chatting like this for a while.
Well, and I'm going to find a picture of you on that kayak trip and send it to you.
Prove it to me.
And I think I have pictures of us digging potatoes. That was because when I was in Ireland, and your mom invited me, to her parents' house to stay for a few days. The very first thing your grandfather did was say, "Pat, we got to go pick potatoes."
Yep.
Dig spuds. So I figured it was turn around as fair play. This was really great, guys.
Yeah, this was wonderful.
Thank you so much for your time, Pat. We really appreciate all the information you kind of gave us.
Yeah. So I'll send you Ronan. I'll send you John Juliana's name, and I have his cell phone number. I'll send you that too. But he'd probably be a pretty interesting person to talk to, because he's such length of time and all of it in the Upper Basin.
And we'll send you a form to fill out just about this being like public domain, proving that we don't have any money on this recording.
Right. Yeah. Okay, cool. Well, thanks for guys.
Of course.
Yeah, thank you so much. Have a good one.